Hey guys, it is me, Kim. So I am back to have another conversation with y'all. This time I want to talk about if it is ever appropriate for men who've been accused of sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, if it is ever appropriate for them to speak publicly, to resume their positions as prominent public figures. All right, I have a lot on this, so, hang in there. So, I was thinking this weekend that I don't believe that there's ever been a time in U.S. history before where a significant number of powerful abusers, and they're mostly men, have been publicly flogged and denounced and disempowered because of the testimonies of the people that they've harmed. And in this Me Too moment, the faces of the harmed are mostly women. It's pretty freaking remarkable. I mean, honestly, we hear the word reckoning all the time. This reckoning has produced a mass reclamation of power, where these women who before felt scared now can come forward and kind of know that there's a possibility that they will be believed, right? We still live in a rape culture, for real. But definitely because of Me Too, it has given people who are disempowered, because those are not just women, the opportunity to come forward and say, time's up. But I also have to say, I'm not sure that this moment is creating the kind of institutional change that leads to broad social transformation. But that's another video. I do always wonder, though, once we have taken these men down, stripped them of their power, pushed them to the margins of our society, what happens next? Because a part of building a world where domination and violence are not the standard is thinking through what to do with the people who do bad things. And this is a fundamental part of the prison abolitionist ethic, right? You do something bad, then what, right? We don't exile you forever. Because I don't believe in the death penalty, and we're not killing these men, that's just not practical, they are now just out there. So what do we do with them? What do we need from them? What do we want them to say? And sometimes I know I've seen people balk at these questions, and I understand why we might be inclined to shy away from those questions, because it does feel like we're putting an undue burden on the people who are already saddled with this impossible baggage, right? When we are saying we have to think of ourselves and our own protection and think about what we do with the people who have harmed us or who cause harm in our communities, that seems like a whole lot. And I recognize that it might feel like we're asking to prioritize the needs or the voices of the abusers, but I sincerely believe that after the reckoning, you have to rebuild. So what does that look like? And if I'm being frank, sometimes I think that rebuilding looks like letting the, quote, bad people tell us how they got to be bad, with scare quotes, and how they're going to be better. And that doesn't mean we let them hog up our spotlights or enrich themselves, okay? It doesn't mean we give them honorariums to speak for huge national magazines, And it doesn't mean that the voices of victims have to be minimized, but I do think that lived experiences matter. So I don't know what it means to have sexually abused a woman and lost everything for it. I don't know what that mindset is. I've never indulged in toxic masculinity. And I want to know as much as we can about it so that we can deter that behavior, so that we can create support systems and alternatives for the people who are not there. That, for me, is the ultimate goal. And I find that sometimes in progressive or lefty spaces, it's easy to get caught up in what feels good or what feels right and ignore what actually works. I think it feels good to say to people, no, you're banished, you're banned, go to the corner, we never want to see or hear from you again, go die. I don't know, though, if that is really changing our society. I don't think so. I think it does something, right? It is important to establish norms. Folks need to know that if you engage in certain behaviors, that you will become a pariah. You could lose everything. That's important. But I don't know if that is enough. How are we actually going to get through to men and other abusers? How are we going to get through to the people who don't value the words and experiences of women, right? Who is going to intervene there, you know? And how can we turn people maybe who have already been abusive, how can we turn them away from that behavior? So that's the practical component of, why I think sometimes we have to let people who have done bad things speak. But there's also something else, I'll be honest. I'm morbidly curious about the thought processes of people I find revolting. A couple of years ago, I went in on Trevor Noah because I thought he was a fool for inviting Tomi Lahren on his show. And I still think that because she's dumb. Her voice isn't valuable to me. But I'm going to be honest, I do enjoy listening to people who are thoughtful about their wrongness. That stuff helps to provide me with clarity on what the work is and how to move forward, right? It really reinforces for me that I'm on the right track. So now that we're about a year into the Me Too movement and the shamed men are beginning to crawl out from under their rocks one by one, and because of my curiosity, I like to read essays and interviews and watch those people who've done bad things explain themselves on television, on YouTube. And it's been both frustrating and utterly compelling to me because no one ever really gets it right. It's so funny that even after you lose it all, you still aren't quite there. But I do want them to. Recently, the New York Review of Books published an essay by Jian Ghomeshi. And this is a man I wasn't familiar with until I read this article. He used to be a television broadcaster in Canada. Apparently, he was very, very famous. He was on a show called Q. It was on the radio and on TV. And I should note that there was lots of backlash to this essay being published. And in fact, the editor of the New York Review of Books actually resigned or was forced out. I don't know. Who knows? But he's not there no more. And along with that Jian Ghomeshi essay, I also read an essay by John Hockenberry in Harper's. And he used to be a radio journalist for WNYC. Now, off the bat, neither of those essays was exceptional, right? When I say that the people who come out in public usually get it wrong, these two are no exception. In fact, I think Hockenberry's essay was plainly bad. But let's talk about him. So Jian Ghomeshi, who is now 50, was kicked out of his job at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation after allegations that he sexually harassed people in the workplace and that he was violent with women he'd had sex with. Now, this was back in 2014, of course, years before the advent of the Me Too movement. And I wasn't at all familiar with the details of this story. Again, I did not know who this man was. So when I read that essay, I was like, oh, this isn't bad, right? I was on his side. He seemed to be sincerely working through some stuff, and I always keep an open mind. He wrote, quote, "It didn't occur to me that I could ever be one of the bad men." And, I was immediately drawn to that because that's a common sentiment, men not having the self-awareness to know when they're doing wrong. And he went on to write, quote, I had become a man who derived all of his self-esteem from external validation. In tandem, everything around me seemed to condone the bullish way a successful single guy might act. This is not an excuse. It's a somber realization. Now, I'm going to say, Jian, that kind of sounds like an excuse, but I am good with that, right? There's some self-reflection happening. Dope. I also thought he had some interesting things to say about what we immediately expect from abusers in the aftermath of the reckoning. Quote, when a man is publicly accused of sexual misconduct in this era, almost invariably the first thing he does is apologize. However heartfelt the remorse, my own experience makes me distrust it. It's a maelstrom of confusion, humiliation, resistance, and conflicting feedback from those around you. How much can anyone really inhabit? I'm sorry. I thought that was super, super poignant, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Junot Diaz was first accused of forcibly kissing a woman who is now a pretty prominent author when she was a grad student. He immediately came out with an apology, right? I've done things, I've done bad things, whatever. But later, months later, when he was profiled for the Boston Globe, he was like, I didn't mean that apology. I take it back. I mean, he literally said that was the biggest mistake I ever could have made. And I think what Jian is saying here comports completely with Junot Diaz being like, oops, didn't mean it. Didn't do anything wrong. Okay, so back to this essay. Finally, I really liked that he attempted to say some very concrete things about the construction of masculinity for men. He wrote, just as my name was trending as the ultimate avatar of bad male behavior, men were confiding in me that, in various ways, they were not much different. I've had countless men contact me in the last 4 years to tell me their stories or somehow commiserate. It is bizarre to become an unwitting repository for men who are bewildered about gender relations or sexual behaviors. I began to see my own actions as part of a systemic culture of unhealthy masculinity. Okay, Jian. I was okay. I liked the essay a lot until I went back and read up on the allegations against him. So here's how a former co-worker described an interaction with him that made her uncomfortable.
Identified. Even today, she's still afraid of Ghomeshi. In 2007, she was in an early morning meeting when he leaned over and told her to stop yawning.
And I yawned again because I was tired, and he said, come on, stop yawning. And then I did it again the third time a few minutes later, and he said, I want to hate fuck you to wake you up.
I want to hate fuck you.
I want to hate fuck you to wake you up.
What does that mean? I
was so confused by it because I'd never heard that term before. And when I thought about it a little bit more, it seemed as though he was, in a quote-unquote playful way, possibly alluding to rape.
He'd later say it was a joke. No one else heard the comment, nor did anyone see when she says he fondled her in the studio a couple of years later.
So after I saw that, I went back to him saying, I never thought I was one of the bad ones. And I'm like, there is no way an adult human doesn't know that telling a coworker that he wants to hate fuck her is wrong. No one on God's green earth thinks that that's appropriate behavior. And it was at that point that it struck me that Ghomeshi still wasn't being honest with himself or with us. And also in that essay, he says that he was responding, his world came crumbling down primarily because of the allegations of one woman. When in fact, the Toronto Star, who did, the real deep dive on all this, uncovered like 20 women with stories about him being abusive in some way. He was, I guess to his credit, acquitted of criminal wrongdoing with the women. But, the Cosby Rule says that when 20 women come together to talk about how you've harmed them, they're not all lying, right? Even if a fifth of them are lying, you're still abusive, right? I just don't believe that this is a grand conspiracy. So then I have to ask, if Ghomeshi is only telling a half-truth here, is it worth telling? When people are talking about the wrong they've done, they do tend to mischaracterize and minimize their faults, right? So instead of 5 women, it's 1 woman. Instead of punching them or slapping them, it's, I just liked rough sex. I should have been more tender. It's very, very common to try to get yourself off the hook by misrepresenting what exactly happened. And the end of that essay was good, but if we're not getting the real thing in thousands of words, is it causing more harm than good? Particularly because we know the women that Ghomeshi did this to are still out there, right? They still have to interact with even the fanfare, even the backlash. How is that re-traumatizing them? So those are open-ended questions I don't have the answer to. Let's move on to John Hockenberry. So Hockenberry was ousted from his position at New York Public Radio because of an internal investigation there that found he harassed his co-workers. So on the scale of 0 to horrifying, what Hockenberry did was inappropriate, but not anything that comes close to Weinstein-esque, right? But still, leave your coworkers alone, okay? Nobody's trying to date you. Nobody wants your compliments. Leave them alone. Hockenberry's essay in Harper's differs from Ghomeshi's in that he mentions his, quote, bad judgment, but in those almost 7,000 words, he makes it clear that he's been treated unfairly from his perspective, and that all of this, the fact that he lost his career is a, quote, overcorrection. And here's a quote from the article. He said, okay, here's his little confession of wrongdoing. He said, in a painful time as my marriage was coming apart, I outrageously suggested to a married coworker that we have an affair. I also pathetically confessed romantic feelings to a brilliant young producer I worked closely with while in a hotel room I had invited her to, and watched her leave upset when it was clear she wanted nothing to do with me. So John Hockenberry is a paraplegic in his 60s. He now can't work because he has this scarlet letter, a reputation of being inappropriate in the workplace. And I do think that there are legitimate questions to ask about what a fair punishment is. Have we decided that being in certain industries is a privilege? So, once you're kicked out, you can never come back in, even though that's your vocation? These are questions that I honestly don't have the answer to, and I think it's more complicated than the sorts of discussions we're having right now. Now, I don't have those answers. I do know that in writing this piece, Hockenberry did himself no favors by writing so pathetically, right? He really views himself as scorned, right? He views himself as a sympathetic character. And, maybe that's how he really feels. That probably is how he really feels. But from a strategic perspective, it was so wrong. Here's what he wrote. Quote, but is a life sentence of unemployment without possibility of furlough the suffering of my children, and financial ruin and appropriate consequence? Does my being expunged from the profession in which I have worked for decades constitute a step on the road to true gender equality? Is my life a reasonable price exacted in the pursuit of justice? Or is my situation an injustice born of a deeper dysfunction in the matters of gender, and a fear of confronting anything beyond revenge, purges, and humiliations? You know, Harper's is a big magazine, right? It's very important. It's an established literary institution. And it is so baffling to me that he used what could have been a compelling essay about what it means to be disgraced and how his life has been upended and how he is now transformed. Instead, he chose to use that time to talk about how we're in the middle of a sex panic and the changing cultural norms that now make certain behaviors impermissible in the workplace are crushing romance. You know, like he outlines in this essay, he wants to have the hard conversation about bringing romance back. And I'm like, you were ousted for making your women coworkers feel uncomfortable. That's not about romance. And you married. And you're married on top of that. It was absurd. And I also have to say, I really hated this passage. He said, quote, "Me Too has created a presumption of rape in every encounter without seeing the urgency of supplying a new language for listening to and conferring consent, or recognizing that men and women and all sexual partners in our time need a new landscape for experiencing one another intellectually, romantically, and emotionally, or must accept the fate of being brutally possessed by the biological primitivism of the sex act alone." No, 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 no. I think it's really possible that Me Too needs some adjustments. I think that's a fair critique. But again, to paint this as us now just being intolerant and uncomfortable and dismissive of natural desires for sexual pleasure and partnership. No, this is about women wanting to feel safe in their workplaces, you know, wanting to feel safe in their romantic and interpersonal relationships. I hate how easy it is to try to dismiss this all under the guise of, well, sex is natural. What are we supposed to do? Leave women alone. So anyways, neither of these essays was great, but I'm still fascinated by what people who are not marginalized structurally, but they now exist on the margins of our culture feel. That stuff is useful for me personally in moving forward, even if I disagree. And you know, I am just somebody who loves to deconstruct things and break them down piece by piece. It is helpful for me in my activism. Maybe that's what it is. And you know, the title of this video is "Should Abusive Men Be Allowed to Speak?" And I think they should, with certain restraints, right? So they don't deserve access to every platform. They don't get to demand equal time. They don't get to demand compensation or respect. You know, they don't get to pretend like they're doing us some huge favor. But I don't think that pretending like these men are gone forever is helpful. You know, they're still there. They're still out there. So what are we going to do? Anyway, I don't have any answers here. I'm getting to a point where I feel comfortable being like, I don't know. I really don't. And I don't know for sure what's right here and what's most appropriate. But I do know that we're at a really good and interesting point historically, and we have the opportunity to go a couple of different directions. And I don't know if we have adequately mapped out which direction is best for creating the type of future we desire. Anyway, guys, that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening to this, watching this video. I appreciate you. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Call me, beat me if you want to reach me. Send me an email or a tweet or a DM. My DMs are open always. If you'd like to help us continue doing this work and get access to exclusive content and reading lists and merch, sign up to be a patron on For Harriet's Patreon page. It's super lit. Sign up for our email newsletter. Text For Harriet to 345-345. I love you guys. I appreciate y'all. Let's have a conversation. This was a long one. Bye.